The wind howled through the mountains, carrying the heavy scent of rain as storm clouds roiled in the night sky. Rain lashed against the rocky cliffs, turning the already treacherous terrain into a slick, unforgiving death trap. Somewhere below, the distant rumble of thunder echoed like the cruel laughter of fate itself. Nathan Cole lay sprawled on the jagged rocks at the base of the cliff. His body broken, blood seeping from deep gashes in his arms and legs. His breath was shallow, ragged, barely discernible against the relentless storm. He had once stood at the pinnacle of success, heir to Cole Industries, a company built on generations of hard work, poised to take over the empire his family had created. And yet, in the blink of an eye, he had been cast down, betrayed by the very man he trusted most. Derek Shaw. Nathan had never seen it coming. Derek had been his closest friend for years. His right-hand man, someone he would have entrusted with his life. But greed had sunk its claws deep into Derek's soul, and on this stormy night, he had struck with ruthless precision. The betrayal had been swift, merciless. They had been standing near the cliffside, the storm rolling in, the city lights twinkling in the valley below. Nathan had turned his back for only a moment, barely registering the shift in Derek's tone, the tension in his stance. Then, before he could react, a violent shove sent him stumbling forward. His world tilted, the solid ground beneath him vanished, replaced by the sickening sensation of free fall. He had tried to grab onto something, anything, but the rain-slicked rocks offered no salvation. The last thing he saw before darkness swallowed him was Derek's face. Expressionless, cold, now, at the bottom of the ravine. The memory blurred as unconsciousness threatened to pull him under. His fingers twitched, his body refusing to move beyond that. The pain was unbearable, radiating from what he knew had to be broken ribs, a shattered leg. His breath came in weak gasps, each one a battle. Above, on the edge of the cliff, a lone figure stood motionless. Derek. He peered down into the abyss, the rain soaking his expensive suit. His features unreadable. There was no hesitation in his stance, no regret. He watched for a few seconds longer, then turned and walked away. He believed Nathan was dead. And just like that, he erased him. Derek would return to the city, claim the throne of Cole Industries, spin a story of tragedy. He would offer somber condolences to employees, to the board, to the press. The great Nathan Cole, lost to a tragic accident. And no one would suspect the truth. But Derek had miscalculated. He hadn't accounted for the lone witness, the one soul who had seen everything. Axel, the German shepherd, had been Nathan's unwavering companion for years. Loyal beyond measure, the moment Derek had pushed Nathan over the edge, Axel had barked furiously, growling and snapping, but Derek had paid him no mind. He had assumed a mere dog was powerless in the grand scheme of things. He was wrong. The moment Derek disappeared into the storm, Axel rushed to the cliff's edge, his keen eyes scanning the darkness below. He whined, ears flattened against his head, pacing in restless circles. Then, as if making an impossible decision, he leaped. The fall was not easy, Axel landed hard, sliding down the muddy incline, his paws scrambling for grip. Sharp rocks tore at his fur, but he pressed on, driven by a force beyond instinct. He had to reach his master. When he found Nathan, the sight nearly undid him. The man who had raised him, the man who had always been strong, now lay motionless, broken. Axel let out a low, mournful whine, nudging Nathan's face with his nose. No response. His ears twitched as he listened, his sensitive hearing picking up the faintest whisper of breath. Nathan was alive, but barely. Axel barked, sharp and urgent, but no help would come. No one knew they were here. And so, Axel did the only thing he could. He stayed. The rain poured mercilessly, soaking through Nathan's torn clothes, washing away the blood but doing nothing to ease his suffering. Axel curled himself against his master's side, sharing what little warmth he had. He licked at Nathan's face, trying again to stir him. Still nothing. But Axel would not give up. The storm raged on through the night, and the world above moved forward, unaware of the treachery that had taken place. Derek Shaw would sleep soundly, convinced that his plans had succeeded. The board members of coal industries would wake up the next morning, oblivious to the truth. But in the depths of the ravine, a bond forged in loyalty refused to break. Axel lay beside Nathan, his eyes never closing, his body a shield against the cold. And when the first rays of dawn broke through the storm clouds, something shifted. A faint, pained breath, a slight movement of fingers, a groan, hoarse and barely audible. Nathan was alive. Axel perked up, his tail thumping once against the wet earth. He nudged Nathan again, and this time, a reaction. Nathan's eyes fluttered open, just for a moment, unfocused and filled with agony. He barely managed a whisper. "Axel." The dog whined in response, licking Nathan's chin, urging him to stay awake. Nathan didn't know where he was. He didn't know how much damage had been done to his body. But through the haze of pain, he knew one thing: he wasn't alone, and as long as he had Axel, he had a chance. Derek had left him for dead. But Nathan Cole wasn't dead yet. And one day, he would make Derek pay. Pain. It was all Nathan could feel as his consciousness flickered back to life. A searing, unrelenting agony radiated from every inch of his body, as if he had been crushed beneath the weight of the very earth itself. His lungs burned with every shallow breath, his ribs protesting violently with each rise and fall of his chest. He tried to move, but his limbs refused to obey, pinned beneath his own battered weight. The rain still poured, drumming relentlessly against the rocks, seeping into his torn clothes, chilling him to the bone. He was alive, but for how much longer? Through the haze of pain, he became aware of something warm pressing against his side. Then, a familiar sound, soft, desperate whines, a rough tongue lapping at his face. Axel, the German shepherd, had not left him, had not abandoned him to the darkness. Even now, the dog's strong jaws clenched around Nathan's soaked shirt, tugging with all his might. But Nathan was too heavy, too broken, Axel's desperate attempts to drag him away from the jagged rocks were futile. Nathan wanted to speak, to reassure his loyal companion, but the only sound that escaped his throat was a weak groan. Axel paused, his ears twitching. He let out a low whimper before lifting his head, scanning the stormy night. Then he saw it, a faint glow in the distance, a break in the relentless blackness. A farmhouse. Hope. The dog hesitated only for a moment, torn between staying with his master and seeking help. But Axel was no ordinary dog. He knew that if he stayed, Nathan would die. He had to go. With one last glance at his injured owner, Axel turned and bolted into the storm. Jack Turner had spent most of his life on this land. His hands, weathered by years of hard labor, had built this farm from nothing. Now, in the twilight of his years, he lived alone with his horses, his shotgun, and the memories of a life long past. He was not a man easily startled, but the furious barking outside his door made his heart skip a beat. Grabbing a lantern, he made his way to the entrance, pausing only to slip on his boots. The rain pounded against the tin roof, and for a brief moment, he considered that it might just be a coyote or some other stray. But the barking was different, urgent, almost desperate. When he pulled the door open, he was met with a sight that made his breath catch. A German shepherd stood before him, soaked to the bone, mud caked into its fur. The dog's amber eyes locked onto his, wild with fear and determination. Then, without warning, the animal lunged forward, gripping his pant leg in its strong jaws. Jack stiffened, his instincts telling him to pull away. But something stopped him. The dog wasn't attacking, it was pleading. "What's wrong, boy?" Jack murmured, lowering his lantern to get a better look. The dog let go only to bark again, pawing at the ground before turning and sprinting a few steps into the darkness, then stopping. Looking back, waiting, Jack understood. Someone needed help. Without hesitation, he grabbed his coat and rifle, then strode toward the barn. He wasn't about to go blindly into the storm. Not on foot. No, if this was as urgent as it seemed. He needed speed. Moments later, he was atop his strongest horse. Lantern in one hand, reins in the other. Axel was already running ahead, leading the way. Jack dug his heels in, urging his horse forward, galloping into the night. The ride was treacherous. The storm had turned the dirt paths into a mess of slick mud and deep puddles, making each step a gamble. But Jack pressed on, following the streak of movement ahead. Axel, undeterred by the weather, weaving through the landscape with the urgency of a creature on a mission. And then, Jack saw him, at the base of the rocky cliff. Barely visible in the dim glow of the lantern, lay a man. Jack's heart lurched. He spurred his horse forward, dismounting the moment he was close enough. The man was in bad shape. Blood stained his torn clothing, deep gashes running along his arms and legs. His breathing was shallow, his face pale beneath the rain-slicked strands of hair that clung to his forehead. Jack knelt beside him, pressing 2 fingers to the man's throat. A pulse, weak but steady. "You're not dying on me, son," Jack muttered. Axel whined, pressing his nose to Nathan's cheek. Jack took a deep breath. He had moved plenty of injured animals in his life. But a man this broken was another challenge entirely. Still, there was no time to hesitate. Bracing himself, he lifted Nathan as carefully as he could, groaning as the dead weight of the man sagged against him. Broken ribs, likely internal bleeding. Jack didn't know who he was. But he knew one thing: this man needed saving. With great effort, he hoisted Nathan onto the back of his horse, securing him as best as possible before swinging up behind him. "Let's go, boy," Jack said, giving Axel a nod. The dog needed no further instruction. They rode hard, faster than was wise in such conditions. But Jack knew time was against them. Every bump, every jolt sent fresh pain through Nathan's broken body. But he remained unconscious, limp in Jack's grip. By the time they reached the farmhouse, Jack's muscles ached from holding the injured man steady. He wasted no time carrying Nathan inside, laying him carefully onto the worn-out couch near the fireplace. He stoked the embers, adding fresh wood until the flames roared to life, casting a warm glow over the room. Axel leapt onto the rug beside the couch, his eyes never leaving Nathan. Jack disappeared for a moment, returning with towels, bandages, and a flask of whiskey. He worked swiftly, cutting away torn fabric, cleaning wounds, wrapping what he could. There was no telling the full extent of Nathan's injuries. But for now, stabilizing him was all that mattered. At one point, as Jack pressed a damp cloth to his forehead, Nathan stirred. His eyelids fluttered open, his gaze unfocused. "Axel," he rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. Jack glanced at the dog, then back at the man. A slow smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Looks like your dog saved your life, son." Nathan didn't respond. His eyes drifted closed again. Exhausted beyond measure, Jack leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. He had seen many things in his long years. But this was something different. As the storm raged on outside, the old farmer knew one thing for certain: this man had survived the impossible, and whoever had left him for dead was about to regret it. Nathan awoke to the sound of crackling firewood and the soft rhythmic breathing of Axel beside him. His body ached, every muscle screaming in protest as he tried to move. The last thing he remembered was the storm, the betrayal, the endless fall into darkness. Yet, against all odds, he was alive. His eyes adjusted to the dim light of the small cabin. The air smelled of fresh wood, smoke, and something faintly medicinal. He shifted slightly, wincing as a sharp pain shot through his ribs. Axel, ever alert, immediately lifted his head, ears perking up. "Easy, boy," Nathan murmured, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. The door creaked open, and an older man stepped inside, carrying a steaming mug in one hand. His weathered face showed little expression, but there was something steady and reliable in his presence. "Well, look who finally decided to wake up," Jack Turner said, setting the mug down on a nearby table. "Thought I might have patched you up for nothing." Nathan swallowed, his throat dry. "Where am I?" "My farm. You had yourself a nasty fall, son." That dog of yours came running in the middle of the storm. Dragged me out to find you." Jack pulled up a chair and leaned forward. "You're lucky to be breathing." Nathan exhaled slowly, letting the reality sink in. He was alive. Barely. But the question that burned deeper than his wounds remained. "Derek," he muttered, his jaw tightening. Jack's expression darkened. "Yeah, I figured as much." He leaned back, folding his arms. "You should know. While you were out, things changed real fast. Your friend, if you can even call him that, declared you missing. Hell, they even held a damn memorial for you." Nathan's fingers clenched into weak fists. "A memorial? That's right. A public event. Press coverage and everything. Your company, officially under his control now." He wasted no time making sure everything tied up nice and neat. Nathan's chest tightened, not just from the pain of his injuries but from the sheer weight of betrayal. Derek had planned it all. The fall, the disappearance, the takeover. It hadn't been a moment of opportunity. It had been orchestrated. Jack continued, "Not just that. But your office got hit the same night you went over that cliff. Someone broke in, wiped out everything with your name on it, documents, contracts, financial records. It's like you never existed." Nathan's breath came faster now, anger cutting through the lingering fog in his mind. "He erased me." Jack nodded. "Looks that way. Question is, what are you gonna do about it?" Nathan pushed himself up slightly, ignoring the pain that flared through his ribs. "I'm going back." Jack raised an eyebrow. "And do what? Walk into coal industries with broken ribs and demand your company back?" He scoffed. "Boy, you need a plan." Nathan knew Jack was right. Derek had covered his tracks too well. But there had to be a way. Then Jack leaned forward, his voice lowering slightly. "I might know someone who can help you." Nathan frowned. "Who?" Jack scratched his chin. "Rachel Myers." Nathan's heart skipped a beat at the name. Rachel had been his assistant for years. Smart, meticulous, fiercely loyal, she had known more about the inner workings of coal industries than almost anyone, including Nathan himself. At times, if there was one person who might still have access to the real records, it was her. Jack watched the realization dawn on him. She was fired the day after your accident. Official story was restructuring. Unofficially, I think she knew too much. Nathan's mind raced. If Rachel still had any of the original documents, anything Derek hadn't gotten rid of, then there was a chance. A small, dangerous chance, but one worth taking. Jack stood. "I can get you to her. But you need to be sure about this. Derek thinks you're dead. If you go back now, you lose that advantage." Nathan looked at his hands. The bruises and bandages covering his skin. He was weak, wounded, not ready, but he couldn't stay hidden. Not while Derek sat in his office, wearing his title, living the life that wasn't his to take. Nathan met Jack's gaze, his jaw set in determination. "I need to see Rachel." Jack gave a slow nod. "Then let's get to work." The night was alive with the sound of celebration inside the grand halls of coal industries. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in golden light. casting reflections over the walls adorned with expensive artwork. The clinking of glasses, the hum of conversation, and the occasional burst of laughter created a symphony of indulgence. At the center of it all, Derek Shaw stood tall, raising a glass of the finest champagne. His smile smug, his suit impeccable. Tonight was his night. He had done it. He had erased Nathan Cole, taken the throne, and secured his legacy. Or so he thought. Outside, just beyond the glow of the city lights, a storm was coming, not of rain or thunder, but of reckoning. Nathan stood in the shadows near the entrance, his breath steady, his pulse strong despite the pain that still lingered in his body. Jack was beside him, his ever-watchful gaze surveying the room, while Axel stood alert at Nathan's feet, his muscles tense, ready. A few trusted allies, Rachel Myers included, were scattered among the crowd. Waiting for the signal, Rachel had done her part. The USB in Nathan's pocket held everything: the fraudulent financial dealings, the embezzlement schemes, the bribes, and most damning of all, the evidence tying Derek directly to the attempt on Nathan's life. The trap was set. Now, it was time to spring it. With a deep breath, Nathan stepped into the light. For a moment, no one noticed. The party carried on, champagne flowed, and Derek continued to bask in the illusion of his untouchable empire. Then, a gasp, then another. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Eyes widening, heads turning. The murmurs built into an uproar. Derek turned, confused by the sudden shift in atmosphere, until his eyes landed on the one person he had never expected to see again. His face drained of color. Nathan saw the flicker of panic, the moment of realization as Derek's grip tightened around his champagne glass. But the man recovered quickly, smoothing his expression, forcing a smile as he stepped forward. "Nathan," he said, his voice even, though his eyes betrayed him. "You're alive. What a surprise." Nathan didn't blink, didn't break his stride. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Derek. Laughter rippled uneasily through the room. Uncertain, forced, but Nathan wasn't here for pleasantries. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the USB. "Let's skip the small talk. You know exactly why I'm here." Derek's smile twitched. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Then let me help you," Nathan said smoothly. He raised the USB for all to see. "This holds proof of every dirty deal, every stolen dollar, and every lie you've told since you took over. But more importantly," his eyes locked onto Derek's, his voice sharp as steel, "it proves you tried to kill me." The room fell silent. Derek's fingers twitched. His eyes darted to the exits. Calculating, but there was nowhere to go. Rachel stepped forward, her voice clear, unwavering. "I kept everything, Derek. Every email, every transaction. You can't talk your way out of this." Derek let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "You're bluffing." Nathan took a step closer. "Am I?" Then, as if on cue, the doors burst open. A squad of uniformed officers stormed in. And at the center of them was Detective Harris. A man Nathan had known for years, a man who unlike Derek, couldn't be bought. The detective's voice rang out like a gavel striking judgment. Derek Shaw, you are under arrest for financial fraud, embezzlement, and attempted murder. Derek's composure shattered. The room, which had once been his kingdom, now felt like a cage. The walls closed in. His empire was crumbling before his eyes. And he refused to let it happen. With a sudden, desperate motion, Derek lunged, shoving a server aside as he made for the nearest exit. But he never made it. A snarl tore through the room, low and guttural, followed by a blur of fur and muscle. Axel launched himself forward, a storm of fury unleashed. The German Shepherd collided with Derek, knocking him to the ground with a force that sent tables crashing and glasses shattering. Derek cried out, scrambling, but Axel was relentless, his teeth bared, his growls vibrating through the marble floor. Officers moved in, pulling Axel back just as they secured the struggling man in handcuffs. Breathing hard, Derek thrashed, his eyes wild as they locked onto Nathan. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice dripping with hatred. "I'll find a way out. You hear me? I'll come back for everything." Nathan stepped forward, looking down at the man who had once been his closest friend. Now nothing more than a bitter shell of greed and failure. His voice was calm, almost pitying. "No," he said simply. "You won't." The officers dragged Derek away, his shouts fading into the distance. The weight lifted. Nathan let out a slow breath, his body finally relaxing as he turned to look at Rachel, at Jack, at Axel, at the people who had stood by him when everything had been stripped away. A slow clap started from somewhere in the crowd, hesitant at first, then growing, and then, just like that, the room erupted into cheers. Nathan had won. Coal Industries was his again. But more than that, justice had been served. As the chaos settled, Rachel approached, smiling. "Welcome back, Nathan." He looked around, taking in the moment, the people, the life he had nearly lost. "Feels good to be back." And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he truly meant it. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the rolling fields of Jack Turner's farm, painting the sky in hues of soft pink and warm amber. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fresh grass, untouched by the noise of the city. For the first time in weeks, Nathan Cole felt at peace. He sat on the worn wooden porch, a steaming cup of coffee resting beside him, his fingers idly scratching behind Axel's ears. The German Shepherd lay stretched out beside him, his eyes half closed, his tail flicking lazily in contentment. The loyal dog, the one who had never abandoned him, had earned this moment of quiet just as much as Nathan had. A week had passed since the night Derek Shaw had been dragged away in handcuffs. In those days, everything had changed. News of the betrayal and crimes committed by Derek had spread like wildfire, shaking the very foundation of coal industries. The board of directors, once blindly following Derek's lead, had quickly distanced themselves, issuing public statements of shock and condemnation. The stock had dipped momentarily, uncertainty gripping investors, until Nathan stepped back into his rightful place. Not just as the heir, but as the leader his company had always needed. The evidence Rachel had gathered had been more than enough. Derek faced multiple charges, and with the weight of corporate fraud and attempted murder against him, there would be no easy escape this time. The justice system would take its course, and Derek would finally pay for everything he had done. But for Nathan, none of that mattered as much as the moment he was living in now. He had spent years believing power and legacy were the most important things. That being at the top was what defined him. But in the darkness of that ravine, bleeding, broken, abandoned by the man he had once called his best friend, none of those things had saved him. Axel had. Loyalty had. The things that truly mattered had nothing to do with power or money. They had everything to do with trust, with friendship, with the unspoken bond between those who refused to give up on each other. Nathan let out a quiet breath, watching the mist rise from the fields. His wounds were healing, but some scars would remain. Perhaps that was for the best. A reminder of the past, of what had been taken, and what had been given back. "You saved me, buddy," he murmured, his voice almost lost in the morning breeze. Axel's ears twitched, but he didn't open his eyes. He simply stretched, shifting closer, pressing his warm fur against Nathan's side. A silent acknowledgement. Nathan smiled faintly. "I don't know what I did to deserve you." Axel finally moved then, lifting his head just enough to nuzzle Nathan's hand before giving a slow, deliberate lick across his fingers. Nathan chuckled softly. "Yeah, I get it. No need to be sentimental." The screen door behind him creaked, and Jack stepped out, a mug of coffee in his hand. He took a seat in the chair beside Nathan, stretching his legs out with a tired sigh. "You look like a man who's been doing some thinking," Jack observed, taking a sip of his coffee. Nathan nodded, his gaze still on the horizon. "I have been." Jack studied him for a moment, then grunted. "And what's the verdict?" Nathan let out a breath, leaning back against the wooden railing. "That I almost lost everything. And somehow, I was lucky enough to get a second chance." Jack nodded approvingly. "Not many people get that." "No," Nathan agreed, "and I don't intend to waste it." Jack smirked, giving him a sidelong glance. "So what now? Back to suits and boardrooms? Back to chasing numbers?" Nathan considered that for a long moment. "Not the way I used to." He glanced down at Axel, at the dog who had defied all odds to save him. "I think it's time I start running coal industries the right way. No more looking over my shoulder. No more trusting the wrong people." Jack chuckled. "About damn time you figured that out." Nathan shook his head with a small laugh. "Yeah, well, some lessons take longer to learn than others." The two men sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunlight slowly creep across the fields. Eventually, Jack pushed himself to his feet, stretching. "Well, don't sit out here too long," he said. "Breakfast is on the table." Nathan nodded, but made no move to get up just yet. Jack gave Axel a quick scratch behind the ears before heading back inside, leaving Nathan and his dog alone once more. After a while, Nathan finally spoke again, his voice quiet. but filled with certainty. "I owe you everything, Axel." The German shepherd let out a soft, contented sigh, his tail wagging just once before he settled back into sleep. Nathan smiled. This wasn't the ending. It was just the beginning.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.